The night Vivienne Okafor almost quit her job at Auberge Dorée was the same night she proved to 47 people that money is not the same thing as worth. She had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon. The restaurant sat on the 15th floor of the Fairmont in downtown Toronto, the kind of place where the sommelier remembered which vintage you'd ordered 3 years ago, and the bread came warm in a linen cloth. Vivienne had worked there for 2 years, and she knew every corner of it. The table by the window that wobbled unless you wedged a folded napkin under the left leg, the way the kitchen swung doors got stuck in humid weather, the exact moment during a long dinner when a guest's wine glass needed refilling before they thought to ask. She was good at her job. She had learned to be invisible in the way that only the most skilled servers ever manage, present enough to anticipate, absent enough to never intrude. The guests barely saw her. That was the point. The booking for Table 12 had come in 3 weeks earlier, a private group in 14 guests. The name on the reservation was Elliot Drummond. In Toronto financial circles, the name needed no explanation. Drummond had made his first 100 million before he turned 38, restructuring failing manufacturing companies across Ontario and Quebec, stripping them down to the bolts and rebuilding them into something that produced quarterly returns, that made other investors feel vaguely ashamed of themselves. He was 51 now, silver at the temples, and he wore his success with the kind of casual arrogance that had calcified over decades into something that no longer required effort. He simply expected the world to accommodate him, and it usually did. He arrived with 12 associates and 1 guest who seemed slightly out of place. A younger woman in a conservative blazer who kept checking her phone and whispering to the man beside her. The rest of the party moved in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who had eaten at tables like this their whole lives. Vivienne took their coats. She poured the first round of water. She smiled and recited the evening's specials with the quiet professionalism she had spent 2 years perfecting. Drummond did not look at her once. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the way he spoke about her. Not to embarrass her. She was too far beneath his notice for deliberate cruelty. He simply did not include her in the category of people worth acknowledging. When she leaned in to refill his glass, he kept talking. When she asked if anyone had dietary restrictions, his eyes moved the man beside him mid-sentence, as though the question had come from the wallpaper. Vivienne kept her face smooth. She had learned that too. The dinner went the way those dinners usually went. The food came out in courses, each plate set down with precision. The conversation at Table 12 was loud enough that the adjacent tables occasionally glanced over. Drummond held court the way certain men do, his voice expanding to fill whatever room he was in, laughter breaking out from his guests at regular intervals in the way that suggested obligation as much as genuine amusement. It was during the 3rd course that the piano became relevant. Auberge Dorée had a grand piano in the corner near the bar, a Steinway Model B that the restaurant brought in a musician to play on Friday and Saturday evenings. Tonight was a Friday. The pianist, a regular named Theodore, had played 3 numbers and was taking a short break, his jacket draped over the bench. Drummond noticed the piano the way he noticed most things he could use. "Any of you play?" he asked the table, gesturing toward the Steinway with his wine glass. A few polite demurrals. Someone said they'd had lessons as a child. Someone else said their daughter played. "I played for 12 years, Drummond said, with the particular emphasis of a man delivering information he expected to impress. "Conservatory training. Grade 8 Royal Canadian before I was 16. He paused to let that settle. "Haven't touched one in years, but some things don't leave you." He was already rising from his chair. No one tried to stop him. No one ever tried to stop Elliot Drummond from doing anything. He settled onto the bench, adjusted it with a loud scrape against the floor, and began to play. Chopin, an etude, or the first 40 seconds of one, before his fingers stumbled and he pivoted smoothly into something simpler, a passage that sounded impressive to anyone who didn't know the piece well enough to recognize the evasion. The table applauded. A few nearby guests looked over and smiled. Drummond stood and took a small bow, the kind of bow a man takes when he has decided in advance that he deserves one. "Now," he said, scanning the room with the expansive goodwill of a man thoroughly pleased with himself, "is there anyone here who thinks they can do better?" It was meant as a joke, the kind of joke that isn't entirely a joke. His gaze moved around the restaurant, slowly, passing over the bar, the other tables, the staff, moving quietly between them. It landed, briefly, on Vivienne. She was standing near the service station, a folded napkin over her arm, watching the room. "What about you?" Drummond said. The table went quiet. Vivienne looked up. She had heard him. She understood was clear. She understood immediately that it was not a genuine invitation. It was the kind of thing men like Drummond said to service staff for the amusement of their guests. A small performance of democracy, a way to demonstrate generosity the vast difference between his world and hers. She was supposed to smile. Maybe say something modest and deflecting. Maybe laugh a little, shake her head, and get back to her work. "Pardon?" she said instead. Drummond smiled, warming to it now. "The piano. Can you play?" Vivienne said. She did not elaborate. She did not explain. She simply looked at him steadily, the way she looked at every guest who underestimated her, which was most of them. Drummond gestured grandly toward the bench. "Be my guest." The restaurant had gotten quieter. 2 tables over, a couple had paused mid-conversation. The bartender was watching. The maitre d', a careful man named Rémy, who had worked in fine dining for 23 years, appeared at the edge of Vivienne's peripheral vision and went very still. Vivienne set down her napkin. She walked across the restaurant, slowly, unhurried, the way she moved through a crowded dining room when she was carrying something that required steadiness. She sat down at the bench and adjusted it without the scraping drama of Drummond's adjustment, a quiet, practiced shift of weight that settled her exactly where she needed to be. She looked at the keys for a moment. Then she began to play. What came out of the Steinway was not what Drummond had played. It was not a polite demonstration. It was not a few bars of something recognizable designed to earn approving nods. What Vivienne Okafor played was the Brahms Intermezzo in A major, Opus 118, number 2, and she played it from the beginning, from the first quiet, searching phrase that seems to ask a question the rest of the piece spends 6 minutes trying to answer. She had played this piece for the first time when she was 11 years old, in a church basement in Scarborough, where her mother, Adese, had found her a teacher who gave lessons on Saturday mornings for $30 an hour. The teacher's name was Mrs. Kowalski, and she had emigrated from Krakow in her 40s and retained a strict, exacting method that had initially made Vivienne cry twice and quit once before coming back. By the time Vivienne was 14, Mrs. Kowalski had told Adese quietly that her daughter had an unusual gift. By 16, Vivienne had been accepted to the Glenn Gould School. She had not attended. Her father, Emeka, was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition the March of that same year. The family did not discuss what this meant for Vivienne's future. They simply reorganized around the new reality, the way people do when there is no alternative, and Vivienne had watched the acceptance letter sit on the kitchen table for 3 days before she put it in a drawer and started looking for work. She was 29 now. She had been waiting tables for 5 years. She had not stopped playing. There was an upright piano in her apartment, a Yamaha U1 she'd bought second-hand and had tuned twice a year, and she played for herself in the evenings after her shifts, sometimes past midnight, the neighbors having long ago made their peace with it. None of this was visible to anyone at table 12. What was visible was the music. The Brahms intermezzo is not a flashy piece. It does not have the kind of runs and arpeggios that announce themselves. What it has is depth. A singing quality in the right hand, a gentle pulse in the left, a harmonic language that seems simple on the surface and reveals itself slowly to be anything but. It requires control, it requires feeling, it requires a musician who understands what it means to hold something lightly without letting it go. Vivienne played it the way she had played it alone at midnight in her apartment, completely. The first person to stop talking was the woman in the conservative blazer at table 12. Then one of the senior associates, a man who had been checking his vote throughout dinner, put the phone face down on the table. Then the couple 2 tables over, who had paused their conversation when Vivienne sat down, did not resume it. By the time Vivienne reached the middle section, where the piece deepens and turns inward, the restaurant had gone quiet in a way that felt different from the ordinary quiet of a dining room. It was the quiet of people who had stopped performing the business of their evening and were simply listening. Drummond stood beside the piano. He had not sat back down. His expression had changed. It was not the indulgent amusement he'd worn when he gestured toward the bench. It was something more careful. He was watching her hands. Vivienne did not look at him. She looked at the middle distance, the way she always did when she played. Not at the keys, not at anything specific, somewhere between the notes and whatever it was the notes were reaching for. She had learned not to perform while playing. Sus! There was a difference between performing and playing, and the difference was everything. The piece ended the way it always ends, not with resolution exactly, but with a kind of acceptance. The last phrase, quiet as a question you've stopped expecting an answer to. Then silence. No one moved for a moment. Then the applause started. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that happens when a group of people have experienced the same thing simultaneously and can't help expressing it. The couple 2 tables over. The bar. A woman near the window who put her hands together and held them there. The sommelier, who was too professional for this, but did it anyway. Rémi, the maitre d', exhaled. Vivienne stood from the bench, smoothed the front of her uniform, and turned to face the room. Drummond was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize. It sat somewhere between admiration and something harder to name. The specific discomfort of a man who has been shown, in public, that his assumptions were wrong. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he said. His voice was different. Quieta. The performance was gone from it. Vivienne considered the question for a moment, not because she was deciding whether to answer, but because she was deciding how much of the answer to give. "I was accepted to the Glenn Gould School," she said. 13 years ago. "I didn't go." Drummond waited. "My father got sick. I needed to work." There was a silence that felt different from the restaurant's ordinary silences. "But you kept playing," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Every day. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, the restaurant had resumed its gentle noise. The clink of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the pianoless music of a full dining room, finding its rhythm again. "I owe you an apology," Drummond said. Vivienne looked at him steadily. She did not make it easy for him. She did not say no, it's fine the way she might have said it a year ago, 2 years ago, in the early part of her 20s, when she had not yet understood what her own stillness was worth. She simply waited. "I didn't see you," he said. "Earlier, at the table, I didn't." He stopped, tried again. "I looked at you and I didn't see you. That was wrong." "People often don't," Vivienne said. It came out even factual, without self-pity. One of Drummond's associates, a woman in her 40s who had been quiet through most of the dinner, was watching this exchange with a careful expression. Later, Vivienne would learn that her name was Priya Mehta, that she was the managing partner of a concert venue and performing arts foundation in the distillery district, and that she had spent the last 14 months looking for a specific kind of artistic director for a new emerging artist program she was building, but that came later. In the room, in the moment, Vivienne did not know any of this. What she knew was that she had walked across a restaurant in her work uniform and sat down at a piano that didn't belong to her and played something true, in front of 47 people who had not expected it, and the room had gone quiet, and she had not needed anything from anyone in order to do it. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything she had spent 13 years making sure she never lost. Drummond's table stayed for another hour. The bill came to just over $4,000. When Vivienne presented it, Drummond took it without his earlier studied inattention. He looked at her directly. The way he presumably looked at people he considered peers. There was a separate envelope beside the bill folder when she picked it up from the table. Inside was a business card from Priya Mehta with a handwritten note. "Please call me. I have a conversation I'd like to have with you about something I think you'd be interested in." No obligation. But I've been looking for someone who plays like that for a long time. Vivienne read it standing at the service station, her back to the dining room. She thought about her father, Emeka, who was 57 now, and moved more slowly than he used to, but still got up every morning and made tea and sat with the newspaper and asked her how work had been. She thought about the drawer where she had put the Glenn Gould letter. She thought about the Yamaha U1 in her apartment, the neighbor who had once knocked on the door at 12:30 to ask her to stop and then stayed in the doorway for 10 minutes listening before going back to bed. She thought about what it meant to keep something alive in you for 13 years with no audience and no reward and no guarantee that it would ever matter to anyone but yourself. She put the card in her pocket and went back to work. She had 3 more tables to close out, a side station to restock, and a long ride home on the subway ahead of her. She had a full shift again tomorrow, but she had the card. She called Priya Mehta the following Tuesday. They met for coffee in a quiet place in Corktown, and by the time the cups were empty, Vivienne had said yes to more things than she could have accounted for 2 weeks earlier. A paid residency, a platform, a series of evening concerts built around young musicians who had taken a different road. She did not quit her job at Auberge Doré immediately. She gave 3 months' notice, and she worked those 3 months with the same care she had given every shift before. Rémi told her she was the finest server he had worked with in 23 years, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. On her last night, she played the piano again, this time for an audience's need to be surprised, without a billionaire's challenge to answer. She played for 40 minutes, one piece after another, and the kitchen staff came to the pass and stood in the doorway, and the sommelier cried a little and was embarrassed about it, and the guests at every table went quiet, not because wealth had been humbled, not because a point had been proven, because music, when it's real, makes a room go still, and there is no amount of money in the world that teaches you to do that. You either have it or you don't, and you have it only if you never stopped. Not in a church basement in Scarborough, not in a second-floor apartment at midnight, not on a Friday evening in a restaurant where nobody was looking. Vivienne Okafor had never stopped. That was the whole story.